Good afternoon or good morning, everyone, and a very warm welcome, whether you are joining us live or watching the replay of this session. It's a rather wonderful feeling. It gets me excited every time to see all your names popping up on my screen. And I can see that you are tuning in from many corners of the world. So it's a delight to have you with us today. Thank you for your interest. I am Pauline Vicard. I'm the co-founder and executive director of Rethinking Global. And joining me today are Felicity Carter, journalist extraordinaire and the editorial director at Rethinking Global, and Erica Noni, who's the founder of Noni Marketing, who's joining us from New York. Good morning, Erica. It's still morning for you.
Morning.
You can't see them, but they are here too. My colleagues, Sarah and Tanisha, who will be interacting with all of us via the chat. And please feel free to add your comments and reaction in the chat and your questions in the Q&A section so that we can see them clearly. For those of you who are not familiar with our organization yet, Rethinking Global is a think tank dedicated to the future of fine wine. So basically, our job is to look at how the world is changing in terms of geopolitics, economics, finance, tech, gastronomy, how societies are evolving, and how those changes are impacting or likely to impact both the production and the distribution of fine wine in the near future. So we work with many contributors, of course, from the fine wine ecosystem, so from top producers to retailers, distributors, strategists, sommeliers, wine critics and journalists, but also with many contributors from outside of the wine world, because in order to understand how the world is changing in terms of geopolitics, finance, tech, and etc., we have the good fortune to work with fellows at Chatham House here in London, or the Brookings Institute, the London School of Economics, the Collège Culinaire de France, l'Observatoire des Habitudes Alimentaires des Français, etc., etc. So sociologists, anthropologists, specialists in geopolitics, tech experts, you name it. And in a nutshell, we do all of this to help fine wine wineries, distributors, and retailers to understand how the world is changing and how that creates risks to be managed and opportunities to be seized. So we are here today and for the next hour to discuss our latest white paper that's just launching today. So it's a pleasure to present it in front of you today. It's Rethinking Fine Wine is our fourth white paper on the topic. Version 3 was published back in 2019, and Felicity and I spent the last 4 months tidying up 3 years of research and hundreds of interviews to deliver this fourth version. I didn't mention in the intro that I am French, but I'm sure you can hear it by now. So we are going to take a big dive into this white paper together. But before going deeper into that presentation, I have kindly asked Erica to share her thoughts on why, first of all, we need a fine wine definition and how this topic resonates with her and the great work that she does at Noni Marketing. Erica, over to you.
Thank you, Pauline, and thank you for allowing me to be a part of today and of this this institute and this effort. I've been involved with Rethinking since 2019, so not since the very beginning, but it's impressed me since day one, and it's really an honor, and it sparks my curiosity every time we have a chance to come together. So a bit about me, I'm Erica Noni, and as Pauline said, I run a fine wine and specialty food marketing agency here in New York. And I started that back in 2014. All of our brands, it's worth saying, are imported brands to the US, and all of our campaigns are activated in the US. And they all have credible and dedicated goals relating to sustainability. And so this combination of facts makes me especially interested in the work that Rethinking Global does and the work that Rethinking Global publishes, because it gives me and my team insights not only into our specific sector, but also how these findings vary across borders and across cultures and even across generations, as you'll see in this beautiful white paper. And so it's useful to us. It's also just a wonderful group of people who are genuinely interested in coming together to collaborate and share ideas and to debate. And I can I can tell you firsthand that debate is one of the richest pieces of the experience of Rethinking. I got to attend the presentation of this white paper the other day in London, which featured a phenomenal debate, an entertaining debate, particularly from Felicity. I have to say, she was a star. And so I hope there's some debate later on and some questions that we disagree on. But for the minute, I'll tell you about my point of view, as Pauline said, about why we're here, why it's important that we're here, why this work matters to me and to the industry from my point of view. I've spent the major part of my career in wine communications, both in a British fine wine merchant, or what we might consider the very fine realm that plays in the secondary market, to the broader reaching realm of fine wine that is sampling campaigns, retail promotions, restaurant promotions, seeking published validations from arbiters of taste, which we might mean journalists by, but sommeliers as well, and increasingly influencers of other stripes. So why do I agree that we need a fine wine definition? Because if we purport to communicate that certain wines are fine wines, and that there's value in positioning them at the top of a sort of pyramid of not only quality, but also certain values, then we have to be prepared to position them in a context and to defend that context. But we can't defend fine wine if we don't know what it is. And we have to work together, which is why we're here. We need a minimum of consensus and collaboration, as Pauline likes to say, among ourselves, producers, but also brand representatives and partners, agencies, everyone down the distribution chain, in order to be effective as a team. And there are some issues that we're facing, not all the same issues, not the same issues across countries, across styles of wine, certainly across generations and specific goals. But from where I sit, very specifically in communications in the US, in fine wine, there are three things that came to mind in particular for me right now that our ecosystem is facing. And the first one should be pretty obvious, which is the continuously changing media landscape. With its attendant opportunities and especially threats, media outlets can rise and fall. Journalism is probably more dynamic and perhaps more precarious a career than it used to be, which is an opportunity and a threat from where I sit. We might see it as a risk that voices of validation and influence are consolidating into fewer portals. But I also tend to be optimistic about this, instead focusing on the resiliency of the tremendously talented voices we have in wine journalism. And here again, I'm going to point out Felicity, whom I admire tremendously. And not only, there are some really talented people who are still producing really interesting, clever content. And their ability to work from anywhere. And as well, we have new voices that have come into the conversation, and these are really valuable. Fine wine is by no means democratic, in my opinion, and I think we would mainly agree with that. But it may be more democratic than it's ever been, which I think is a topic for another debate. A second issue that I see, and this comes through in particular in the white paper, is generational trends. So our goal, our need to engage the interest of younger people in fine wine, people whose interest we don't need to retain, we actually have to instigate, we have to engage in the first instance. And this is true both for the commercial resilience of our brands, because admittedly, we are a commercial piece of a pie. We are looking to promote brands and to sell wine. And we can measure this in terms of sales and profitability. But it's also relevant in terms of preserving a culture of fine wine, or even creating a culture of fine wine for some new enthusiasts. And this involves enjoying wine in moderation, which I think is one of the most beautiful virtues of fine wine, that it represents enjoyment, greater enjoyment, better wines, but perhaps less of them. And then a third challenge, which may be a bit more niche, but has been resonant for me and my team recently, is the occasional loss in translation between our producers and our target audiences. And this has always been true, particularly when we work with imports, we work across borders. But even as we all speak the same language, and honestly, a lot of my partners in other countries speak better English than I do as a second language, we still sometimes define terms differently, and we don't realize it. So as an agency, we sometimes have to serve as interpreters. And an example that I realized only recently concerns the word culture itself. In the USA, we use the term quite broadly, such as a good work culture or a culture of curiosity. Culture means lived experience, and it can be applied kind of however we want in US culture. But what I've realized is that, at least for some of our European partners in particular, culture can have a more specific application to the higher arts, and it can be reserved for reference to performance culture, such as museums or theater, historical culture. And so to me, the value in navigating this difference in definitions so that we can work together effectively mirrors the importance of defining fine wine so that we can work together more effectively. And so once again, I'm really pleased and proud, honored to be here. I hope that we'll engage and we'll have some good ideas to share. I'm especially looking forward to hearing Pauline's presentation and Felicity's point of view as well. And so I thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Erica. And I was smiling through your demonstration of the definition of culture, because for me, culture is still also a synonymous of crop. I know it's a false friend between English and French, but when people say culture, we have, I mean, French means both crops and culture as you defined it. So for, you know, traditional French people, it could also just be cultivating the floor, which is also another understanding of that word. So,
right.
yeah. So I am going to share my screen now, and I hope it's going to work, because I haven't done that in quite a few. Can you see my screen now? Yeah. All right. So as I was saying in the introduction, we've started this white paper with a lot of questions. And we now have, you know, 30 minutes to discuss some of them. So I thought we could gather, you know, we could only talk about 4 of the key questions that we are discussing in the white paper. And the first one that is as a key question to discuss, if my presentation wants to work, yes, is why do we need a fine wine definition? And I think, Erica, thank you for doing such a good work in summarizing from your point of view why a shared definition is actually valuable. If I can just add some points from my personal experience in that, is that, again, as I mentioned in the introduction, I'm French. I grew up in the vineyard in the 1980s in a winemaking family. And, you know, the first decades of my life, I spent on the Enjambeur, driving the tractor with my dad, you know, spraying pesticides without any kind of protection, because that's how it used to be at the time, and actually learning how to cut your sugar bindings, you know, for chaptalization without the customs people knowing too much about it. So if you want any tips on that, on how to buy sugar in France, just let me know. But actually, more seriously, I grew up seeing my parents and their estate gradually declining, crashing, and I've seen my parents, you know, gave up because they were not able to adapt to the big change that was around them. And they were not able to actually transition from being winemakers or vignerons, as we say in French, to being business people and to adapt to the world that we see today. And so I think there's a real chance, and I don't want to be too cynical or too dramatic about it, but I think there's a real chance that people become also on a different point of view, become actually quite cynical about fine wine. Because if we think about it, fine wine can be considered a product that's exclusively for the rich, that exclude a huge part of the population, while actually using very, very valuable resources of lands and water. For example, we know how water becomes scarce in many, many parts of the world, and also having a negative environmental impact during its production, and also containing alcohol, so with a potential negative social impact too. So there is a scenario where we might actually lose our license to operate, and that fine wine doesn't really fit in the culture of tomorrow. And just like, for example, meat has to rethink its place in society today, I think fine wine should examine its place in the society of tomorrow. And as Erica said very, very well, we can't protect something if we can't define it. If we don't know what it is, we can't protect it. And also something that I'd like to enhance today, fine wine also has a tendency to think it is worthy of protection because it's a product of history and a product of culture. But maybe, just maybe, we also need to talk about responsibilities and the responsibilities of, you know, sitting at the top, and what we need to actually put in place in order to be worthy of protection. So that also can be a very good topic for debates. And that's, to me, why we need a definition. But as Erica mentioned again, we need some level of consensus so that we can have collaboration. And there's a beautiful quote in the white paper that I like very much from Antonio Graça from Sograp in Portugal, which is, we need to move from efficiency to resilience. And in order to do that, collaboration is a very, very good way to go and to accelerate those change and those transition. So that's for the first question. And then the second one that is quite logical, because we are talking about the definition of fine wine here, is what is a fine wine? And so just to give you a bit of background on the methodology that we use. So when we publish those types of publication, we use different methodology. This first one, we've started from the inception of Arini. So we've started trying to define fine wine since 2017. And when we started 5 years ago, we've asked 200 members of the trade. So in the UK, but not only, in the US, in France, in South America, in Australia, in South Africa, in Asia, what is a fine wine to you? So we've done a first round of 200 questionnaires, and then we analyzed all the verbatim, all those answers, and we tried to extract some of the attributes that were common into all of them, or so frequently actually quoted by the people we were interviewing, that we thought it was worthy to bring into the definition. And over the years, that's something that we continue actually to do. So if you haven't done yourself, I know that many people in the online room today have already given us their definition. Thank you very much for being part of that study. And if you haven't yet, we are very interested in receiving your own very own definition of fine wine. So you can actually reach out to me or to Sarah if you want to share that, because we continue. And that's also why the definition is changing and evolving. Because when we've published the first white paper in 2017, fine wine only had 3 attributes. So we've only seen, 3 attributes standing up from all the dialogues that we had. And now today I'm going to present 5. And it's actually not that surprising that the definition has been evolving quite a lot for the last 5 years, because if you think about it, fine wine is a social object which is made and understood and interpreted within a given society and within a given culture as Erica described it, not the culture as crops. But as society evolves, our understanding, our conception of fine wine is also evolving. So I'm sure that when we'll publish the 5th edition of this white paper in a couple of years, the definition will have evolved again. So first, the first 3 attributes that we had, the first one, well, quite logically, to be a fine wine, you need to have intrinsic qualities. And that's a language that many of you will recognize, because it's typically what you learn through how to recognize quality through the WSET program, for example. But a fine wine needs to have harmony, to have balance, to have length, to develop in the glass, to develop in the bottle, and also to have a capacity to age. So that's a very big one and a very important one. Then secondly, fine wine needs to have a capacity to provoke emotions. And that was a very strong attribute. And we had loads and loads of stories that were like, it was 1978 and the fire was cracking in the chimney, and my granddad opened that bottle of blah, blah, blah. And I can remember exactly what I was eating or who I was with. So it's a capacity to generate emotion that are so strong that they actually stay with you through time, they make that memory stand in time. Like I will always remember where I was when France won the World Cup in 1988, or those kinds of big memories that we will share forever and that we will have and we are able to relive forever. And for many people, it's actually the difference between a good wine and a great wine. A good wine being simply good and a great wine having the capacity to provoke those types of emotion. And I hope that you had many of those wines because they're kind of amazing. And the last attribute that was here since the beginning was the fact that fine wine doesn't happen by mistake. There's a very strong intent from the winemaker, from the person, the man or the woman actually doing the wine, that from the beginning want to create the best that they can do. So sometimes, I mean, it can be difficult to define what a fine wine is, but to define what a fine winemaker is actually easier because they all share that common purpose of doing the best that they can. So that's a common thread. Now, what that best actually means and how they interpret what best means in terms of practice in the vineyard or in the cellar, that's where you find the nuance. But in every situation, there's this kind of vision, what they want to express, their own sense of truth on what being the best means. So that's happened, from the beginning. We had those three since 2017. And then as we progressed and as we continued our exploration of what fine wine is, we had another attribute coming up that is about sustainability. Because when you think about it, it takes a lot of time to start a fine wine vineyard. It takes a lot of time to have the grapes quality that you want. It takes a lot of time to manage or to achieve the vision that you want to have with the wines. And if you look at the marketing side, it takes a lot of time to actually establish a fine wine brand. So fine wine lives within that long-term approach. And in today's world, if you want to be able to continue that long-term approach, you can't really do that without being sustainable. So it wasn't really surprising to see sustainability rising up and being more and more important, a more and more important part of the fine wine definition that we were collecting from many different parts of the trade. And I can just actually mention here that this is a trade-based definition, because in the white paper, you will also see, I'm not going to talk about it today, but you will also see that there's one of the chapter where we ask the consumers how they understand fine wine and do they understand fine wine the same way as we do? And sustainability might not be as important for the consumers as it is for the trade, but I will let you discover that in the white paper. So sustainability has also very different nuance and is interpreted in many different ways within the fine wine ecosystem. But there's always three kinds of dimension to it. The first one being environmental sustainability and the things that you do to maintain the quality of your soil and the quality of your environment. And then the first disagreement or nuance appears when people are like, maintaining is not enough, we need to improve. Preserving is not enough, we need to improve. But that's still part of the environmental sustainability. Then the second part is everything that's linked to social sustainability and actually thinking about our communities around us. That goes from our staff to our communities and our consumers. And how can we manage the negative impact of our productions on those communities and groups of people? And the second one is financial sustainability. And that's where we actually propose a slight change of maybe paradigm, but we've been talking about profitability, which is how much money do you need to be happy, or how much money do you need to make your stakeholders happy, depending on your structure, to financial sustainability, which is now thinking about how much money do I need to make, or how do I need to use my profits in order to still be here tomorrow? So there's a slight nuance between the two. And we're exploring this in the definition as well. And this year, we've added also a fifth attribute, being recognition or reputation, if you want. And that was a very, very big question. We were wondering, do you need to be recognized? Do you need to have a reputation in order to be considered fine? I mean, can you be fine if no one knows about you? And that's the only attribute that it wasn't a consensus. Like through the different interviews that we had, nobody seemed to agree. You know, we didn't have a clear part of the trade that says, yes, we need reputation, and others saying, no, we didn't have recognition. You don't need reputation to be fine wine. You can intrinsically be a fine wine even if no one knows about you. We chose to, however, put recognition in the definition this year and add it for two main reasons. The first one, because we've seen the impact of recognition on distribution. So if you are not recognized, if you don't have a reputation, that changes the way you are distributed. So there has a direct financial impact on this, and that plays on your financial sustainability. But also, if you're not recognized, if you don't have the reputation, that you're not part of the world, and you can't change the definition from within. So you can't bring your sense of truth within, the ecosystem, and you can't make it evolve or change. And the second reason why we chose to actually include recognition is because if the trade doesn't really agree on whether or not we need it, consumers actually agree. They need recognition. When we ask them, well, what does a wine need in order to be seen as fine for them? The fact that it comes from a famous recognized wine region, or famous recognized wine estate, or famous recognized wine grape variety sometimes, because the fame of the grape variety also plays into account. It's always one of the first attributes. However good a wine can be, if it's not widely recognized, consumers fail to see that as a fine wine. So it's also why we actually chose to have that aspect in the definition. And so when you put all of this together, you have this long definition that I hope is complete. So a fine wine is complex, balanced, with the potential to age, though highly drinkable at every stage of its development. It has the capacity to provoke emotions and wonder in the one drinking it, while reflecting the expression of truth intended by its maker. It is widely recognized while being environmentally, socially, and financially sustainable. So you can let us know what you think about the definition on the chat, if you think we've actually forgotten some aspect, if you are surprised, if what do you think about that definition? I can't see all the comments now, but then everything, I'll go back and distill them after the presentation. It will be quite interesting to see what you think about this. So that's the second questions that we ask. And so you will see the way the white paper is organized. We have 5 chapters that are actually research-based. So we have different methodology of arriving to this conclusion, but there's always a methodology. And then this year, what we decided to do with Felicity was, over the last 3 years, there was many questions that we've been asked across different countries and across different presentation. And we thought we could try to answer them. So those are more essay forms and based on our own opinion more than any kind of research methodology. But one of the questions we were asked all the time that actually ties into that big question of what is a fine wine, and is fine wine the same as luxury wine? So just to share some opinions on this, we've used Peter Young and Liz Thatch definition. I'm sure that most of you know Peter and Liz and the amazing job they've done at defining what luxury wine is and what luxury wine marketing is. If you haven't read their book, I would highly recommend it. But luxury wine is of the highest quality, coming from a special place on earth, has an element of scarcity and elevated price, and provides a sense of pleasure and privilege to their owners. So if you compare both definitions, the Arini one that I've just mentioned and the Young and Thatch one on luxury wine, the essay ponders both definition, and I think we can see clearly that there's 2 common points between fine wine and luxury wine. The first is the highest quality. That is a no-brainer. We know this. Either luxury or fine wine needs to be of top-notch quality. And then there's this sense of pleasure that we find, even if we talk about the drinker and they talk about the owner, which is an interesting nuance. But I mean, we have this sense of wonder and, you know, having those little stars in your eyes, they have this sense of pleasure. Now, for the rest of the attributes, they are quite different. And of course, I don't want to influence anyone. I will leave you with those two definitions and you can ponder and see how they differ for you. For me, it's also, you know, if I want to summarize it, fine wine is mostly producer driven. So the vision of the producer is really at the heart of it. And of course, fine wine are expensive. And of course, fine wine are most of the time scarce and rare and difficult to find with an elevated price. But it can mostly be like a consequence. When for luxury wine, when there is when you actually want to convey a sense of pleasure and privilege, then scarcity and elevated price actually becomes part of your strategy. And I'm not putting one definition above the other or saying, you know, luxury wine is better than fine wine or vice versa. Firstly, because it's really interesting, culturally speaking, when I present those two definitions in different parts of the world, you have countries that are like, well, luxury wine are clearly better than fine wine. And in a country like France, people will see luxury wine as the devil because we talk about marketing and selling, when we normally want to focus just on the purity of the artist vision. So no judgment of my part. What I often say to the French is like, at least luxury wine talks about the consumer and the owner, when we don't really, and if we forget to speak or to take the consumer into account in the future, that might be a problem. So that's always the joke that I'm doing in France. But I will leave you make your conclusion on this one too. Then we also explore what makes a classic, and it's a beautiful essay by Felicity Carter on this presentation. And this time we actually went to the world of literature to actually see what a classic is in the world of writing, and if we could do any kind of parallel about a classic as a book and a classic as a wine, and if that could help us define what a fine wine is. That's really interesting. Again, I will let you read that essay. But from a classic being groundbreaking and innovative and be recognized both by the critics that are actually the judge of aesthetic taste and also the public. So they give, you know, the essay gives examples of work that have been recognized by one but not the other and not achieving the status of classic. And then also the fact that it's relevant throughout time. And something that I like very much is something that inspires others a lot. So it set up some trends, and that work, you know, that work is adapted, translated, and suddenly, you know, we had Harry Potter, and now we've got loads of children books that are around magic because it created a whole universe of style and genre. So it's a really good essay. I would recommend it again. As per the third question that we ask, the third big question that we ask in this white paper is, can you be fine alone? And that's one of the newest questions that we've asked to our contributors this year. I wanted to understand the part of the individual versus the part of the collective that we explained, because as Erica said, those words, you know, collective or collective organization or individual can be understood differently in different cultures and mean different things in different contexts. So I wanted to understand this. Can you be fine alone? Can you decide to create a fine wine and just put it on the market and boom, it's a fine wine? Or do you need the support of other people? How does it work? So again, through a big series of interviews and questionnaires, we've actually identified 7 players, 7 people throughout the value chain of fine wine that all have a role to play in giving fine, you know, a status to fine wine and conferring that status of fine wine. And I think it's beautifully summed up in what Jamie Good calls the community of taste. And if you look at it, and if you look at those names and if you look at those jobs, there's nothing really surprising. It goes from the producers to the collectors, with, I mean, all of you in the audience surely fits in one of those categories. But what it clearly demonstrates is that, no, you can't be fine alone. Fine wine is a collective work, and every step of the value chain has its role to play in order to confer that status to a wine. So of course, from the producers that start with the vision and the ethos and their sense of truth, to the distributors or the sommeliers or the retailers that actually make it available to the audience, to the critics that do play that kind of eye of Sauron kind of thing, making a wine visible and recognizable, to the collectors that sometimes I think, and collectors are fascinating to study, and sometimes I think we undermine their actually role and their action into shaping the market for fine wine. They have huge influence in some niche parts of the wine world. And of course, and the last one is the outsiders, and you can understand outsiders in two ways. The outsiders being the export market, because you need a bit of take a step back from your own market to actually, and that's a role that the English trade, for example, has played for years, to actually see and to actually be the export market for new producers and actually benchmark them against the rest of the fine wine world, but also the outsiders within a wine region. We had so many examples of winemakers that are not from that region, that comes from another part of the country, or sometimes from even another country, with resources, so some financial resources, but also different vision, that, you know, enter a rural area in France without the weight of the legacy and the heritage and the history, and actually change things and make the region change and move forward. So they have a big role to play as well. And some of the partners that we had, from Chêne Bleu to Yvan Massonat or Nigel Grinning at Felton Road, at the physical events in London and Paris, were actually embodiments of those outsiders that have changed their region within, and made the notion of fine wine evolve in those regions. The essays that we wrote about, or like the personal questions that we explore to get in the white paper around that notion of can you be fine alone, is that shift from typicity to authenticity, or at least that's, you know, a change in language that they've been seeing over the last few years. When I was growing up, everyone was talking about typicity. Typicity was king. Everyone wanted to be typical and adhere to that notion of typicity. And now, you know, over the last maybe, I don't know, 3 or 5 years, the language authenticity, the word authenticity is now in front of the stage. And I wanted to interrogate that. How did we move from typicity to authenticity? It's a long essay, so I can't sum it up in 1 minute, but basically what my point of view in this one is that typicity is kind of a collective notion. So when I was growing up, the only reason my parents' wines were typical or had some typicity is because everyone was doing the same thing. So grapes were harvested the same day. People were doing more or less the same thing in the cellar. And at the end of the day, wines were very similar. So you can have a regional typicity. Now, authenticity is more like, I just want to do my individual vision of the wine. And so it brought us tremendous rise of quality in some regions, because people stopped harvesting when the government in France, for example, told you when to harvest, but they harvested when they thought, ripeness was good. And then they extracted tannins in a different way, and then they worked in a different way. And so it gives us amazing wines that are individual vision or individually interpreted. But then the consequences now, because of that shift to authenticity, and probably because of climate change also, some regional identity are more and more difficult to recognize. And if there are a Master of Wine student in that room today, they will know that recognizing the origin of a wine now is more and more challenging, not only because of climate change, but I think also because there are more and more individual signature when it comes to fine wine for you know, again, not saying if it's good or bad, just saying it's an interesting shift. And it's also an interesting shift that ties in with how our global societies are evolving from something where collectivity was very strong to something where individuality is stronger today. And we also explore the role of the markets in the making of terroir. So again, we've seen that fine wine is not just the mere decision of a producer. It comes with the participation of many, many people in the value chain. So we also explore, you know, usually terroir, at least in France, is understood as being a combination of climate, soil, and people. People being the people that make the wine. And then the hypothesis in this one is that, well, it's also people that sell the wine, and not only the cities and the markets that have been crucial to develop some fine wine regions and to allow them to be where they are today. So sometimes actually thinking that terroir is based on the soil and the climate is also forgetting that the market can have a role to play in that. So we ponder that in an essay too. And then the last question, but I would say one of the most important one, is does fine wine have responsibilities? Because we could argue and we could battle for hours about who's fine, who's luxury, who gets into what category. I mean, for me at least, defining this is interesting, but it's only a starting point so that we can talk about the responsibilities that we all have, regardless of being fine or luxury. If we want to sit at the top, if we sit at the top of that pyramid, we need to make sure that the base is solid, and we also need to make sure that we do everything in our power to maintain our social license to operate. So in order to determine what was needed in order to do that, again, we've asked our contributors, and we've had that some workshops and some exercise about if fine wine was a brand, or if fine wine was a collective brand, what would be the values that would be embodied by fine wine? What would every producer need to agree on so that we can have a fine wine collective identity, if that makes sense? And we've identified 10 values of fine wine, from excellence and the need to thrive for, again, quality and pushing how we understand quality and always questioning how we can be better, consistency through time, responsibility, confidence, sense of place. The 10 of them, they are very important, all of them. You can discover them in the white paper. And then we also, and that leads to, you know, what it means to have thought leadership in fine wine, and what can leaders do, and how should leaders lead. Again, it's all open to discussion. It's just a base for more conversation. And the last thing that we ask them is, what are the core issues to address? And if we wanted to have this, what we would need to be doing quite soon, from addressing what causes harm through our production line and value chain, to commit to positive, resilient vineyard, or Erica mentioned also drinking in moderation or drinking respectfully, and invest in people. And all those questions, very key questions on diversity, equity, inclusion, and also address accessibility, because we see more and more fine wine disappear from the shelf, and sometimes being sold, you know, I know that direct to the consumers is very big in the US, but we see more and more direct to private consumer sales here in Europe as well, meaning that some wine brands are no longer available to the public or in the shelves, and also the prices are, some prices of those classic fine wine are rising. So what does it mean for the consumer, but also what it means for the winemakers? Because when we've asked, you know, producers from, for example, the fine wine world that started with a blank page, how did you build your vision for fine wine? How did you envision this? Most of the time, they all answer the same thing. Well, I've spent, you know, years tasting the classics and tasting the benchmarks of qualities from Europe and everywhere else. Well, what if those classics, what if those niche of fine wines are no longer available to the winemakers? Aren't they going to, you know, create a new style? When you exclude from a category, usually you create your own category. So, you know, what are the fine wines of tomorrow going to taste like if people can't actually access and taste the ones that we have today? that's it for me. Sorry, I went really quickly and then I got worried about the time because I really want you to have a lot of time for questions and things. I just wanted to underline that, you know, Fine Wine, Rethinking Fine Wine is our latest publication, and it might be the most intellectual one, but it's of course not the only thing that we do at Arini. I've passed the slides very quickly, but we do podcast articles, and we do 4 publications a year. So this is the latest one, but the one we've published in September was looking at sustainability and what it means for the fine wine world. So again, taking that kind of funnel approach when we start by asking what can agriculture be, in what can a sustainable agriculture mean, and how we fit in this, to, you know, how we can work on respectful drinking and all of this. We also released a publication in April of 2022 that's called Fine Wine and the Restaurants, where after the pandemic, when restaurants reopened, we were actually wondering how many of them actually reopened, and when they reopened, what was the philosophy of the chef, of the owners, what changed in the understanding of excellence and what they wanted to do after COVID, and what impact it had on the wine list and on the job of sommeliers. And finally, the big one that we do, because in this white paper, we talk about it very briefly, because we've got a full report dedicated to them every other year, the future of fine wine consumers, where we study, where we have, you know, 80 pages of reports on who are the fine wine consumers, what are their behaviors, the expectation, and how are they changing in different markets from the UK, the US, mainland China, Hong Kong, and this year we are adding France and Japan. So if you are not yet a member of Arini, we actually exist thanks to the members and the partners. Please be you are more than welcome to join us and be a part of the conversation. There's always more room and more seats around the table. So you can reach out to me or to Sarah on the chat to know how you can join and how you can be part of those conversations. But that's it for me now. I'm going to stop sharing. There you are. Okay. And we now have a bit of time for questions. So I'm going to look at the questions in the Q&A, something that I didn't have the chance to do before. Oh, that's a good one. Your definition talks about the intention of the winemaker, but doesn't mention terroir. Is winemaking more important than terroir in fine wine? That's a very good one, because actually we didn't mention terroir in the definition because it's culturally connoted, and it's one of those words, as Erica mentioned at the beginning, that can have various interpretation in different cultures or in different countries and different moments of time as well, because it evolves. So for us, the intention of the winemaker and that sense of truth can include or not the need or the want to express a terroir, because it's not all fine winemakers that actually, I'm not going to say that actually believe in terroir, but that believe in terroir as, for example, the French understand it. They might believe in terroir in a different way. They might translate that by sense of place more than terroir. So that was our way of being neutral in actually allowing them to express their sense of truth, whether or not they believe in the notion of terroir, or however they choose to interpret that notion, if that makes sense. Is the idea of responsibility as part of the definition of fine wine relevant just to producer or to the whole supply chain? Again, I mean, do you want to, I've talked for so much time. Do you want to take that question, Erica or Felicity? Do you think that notion of responsibility is just for producer, or how does that echo to the rest of the supply chain? And for example, Felicity, to your job as a journalist.
Obviously, I think it belongs to everybody, but I do think, as we talk about in the white paper, there are specific responsibilities that accrue to people who are at the top of the chain, simply because they have a much bigger voice and they have more resources open to them than other people do. That's my short answer.
Erica?
Yeah, I think I would love for everyone to take responsibility and define what it means for them at their piece, their spot in the value chain. But I think we have to remember that a fine wine producer produces fine wine and stewards land much of the time, maybe not all the time. Whereas a restaurant doesn't only serve fine wine. A restaurant does a lot of things. And so to be responsible, although that is a point at which responsibility is probably the most palpable, perhaps, in terms of overconsumption. We can't necessarily paint with a broad brush what responsibility means across the value chain.
Are educators part of the community defining fine wine? And I've seen some comments on the chat as well on this. That's a very good comment. And I'd love to have Felicity's opinion on this. We didn't actually identify them on the 7 people that makes the fine wine definition, maybe because actually so far educators' role wasn't to give fine wine a status, but more to, communicate and educate about wine. And the reason why I'm hesitating, it's because at the moment we are doing a big research work on the future of wine education and what it means to be a wine educator today, and the role of a wine educator today in the many forms that we see in different continents, because wine educator don't see themselves having the same role in different places of the world. So to that question and to Joanna's comment on the chat, we will be able to answer more fully in a couple of months when we've got all those results about this. And if you want to participate in those research about what it means to be a wine educator today and what we need to do in order to create the wine education of tomorrow, you are more than welcome. Yes, we do. Sorry, I'm reading the question. Do you have any research on fine wine consumers and what they think? Yes, that's very quickly what I presented at the end. We've got a full report that's called The Future of Fine Wine Consumers. And that's an ongoing research that we do with Négociants from the Place de Bordeaux, which is called Mestres Arts. We started in 2018 doing that research, both quantitative and qualitative. So we run interviews with collectors and high net worth individuals all around the world. And we also do quantitative research in partnership with Wine Intelligence. And we've studied 6 markets so far, the UK, the US, China, and Hong Kong. And you can find that report already live and available for members on the IRINI website. We are going to publish data about France and Japan this year, and we update that study every 2 or 3 years, depending. So, and it's a full report. It's 80 pages. We have to, it's how we have 3 price brackets, and then we see how consumers differ in their behaviors depending on the price bracket they buy in. It's a fascinating study as well. Well, the definition of fine wine continued to evolve. Well, yes, I think, because as I mentioned, fine wine is a social object. And so as society evolved, our views and our interpretation of fine wine is going to evolve as well. And I'm going to speak for the French now, because obviously that's the culture I know the best, but there is a tendency, for example, shared by French people, to actually believe that fine wine is actually something that never changed and always been like this. And, we've been like this since the monks and for 600 years. But actually, it's an evolving notion of fine wine. And the fine wines of today are not the same as the fine wine of 30 years ago, not just because the climate was different, but because our way of understanding it and interpreting them is also changing. I am interested in the debate in London. Do we need to separate fine wine from the rest of the wine? Well, Felicity, do you want to summarize this one? So just to give you a bit in context, in London, after the presentation of the research, we had a debate that was about, do we need to cut fine wine from the rest of the category? It was an Oxbridge style debate, so everything that was presented might not have been what the debaters actually personally thought, but it was made on purpose to go very far on one hand and very far on the other hand, and actually ask people what they thought about it. Felicity, do you want to summarize what's been said in that debate?
Well, I was on the side of the debate of no, and it's something I actually believe, because the only way you could separate fine wine from the concept of wine generally would be to come up with a very tight definition of what fine wine is. And that, as soon as you do that, you'd start to involve who gets to say, who gets to certify, who gets left out. It wouldn't be practical. And also, you don't want a world where people who end up in the wine category it would immediately publicly denigrate them as not being, good wine producers. And fine wine is fluid. There's always, in fact, if you look at the secondary market over the last couple of years, what is called fine wine and what is traded as fine wine is exploding. It's a growing category, so you don't want to restrict it.
Where does premium, whatever that means, overlap with fine? It's a good question. I think we didn't really consider premium.
Can I jump in on that one?
Yes,
I think premium is very much a marketing tool.
Yeah.
I don't think it has any meaning that the wine trade itself would all universally recognise.
Exactly. Well, looking at the time, I would like to hand it over to Felicity, because Felicity is amazing at summarising everything. So if you can leave us with your main takeaways. I'm actually
in the 2 minutes, in the 1 minute I've got left, I'm actually not attempting to summarise what Pauline said. I just want to leave everybody with one thought. When we did the first Arena event I went to was in 2018, and we had an oil executive there who stood up and he said, "You are going to lose your social license to operate and you're not even aware of it." And this was the first time we talked about social license to operate. And he said, when I joined the oil industry, we were the good guys. We were the heroes. We put people's lights on. We made their cars run. We made the world run. And now everybody hates us. And he said, in my time, I've seen tobacco do that. Tobacco used to be family-run businesses from Virginia, and they went from being people who provided employment and pleasure to the people that we all hate. And you're on the same road and you don't know it. And at the time, we thought that was absolutely ridiculous, I think. But if anybody's watching the news and saw that Canada last week came out and said there is no safe level of wine drinking. Now, I personally believe never bet against something that's very ancient, whether you're talking about bread or you're talking about religion or you're talking about beer or wine. Something that has existed for thousands of years fulfills a human need and exists for a reason. But I don't think we're going to see prohibition, but we are very swiftly moving towards a time when wine is losing its luster. It's losing its luster as a definition, as a defining characteristic of sophistication, as something that is part of ordinary life. And we don't, even though we're sitting here talking about fine wine, we never want to live in a world where the only wine available is fine wine for people who have a lot of money. And I think the thing that's so important about Arena is it offers a forum where people can come together and talk about these issues, which aren't simply philosophical issues, they're really important social issues. So my final word is I would encourage everybody who's not a member to come and join the conversation.
Well, thank you for this closing remark, right on time. So the only thing that I've got left to say is the exact summary is available to all, and you can find it now on the website. And if you want to access the full paper, you can become a member, because Felicity said it was a good thing. So, Thank you very much all today for being with us. Thank you, Felicity and Erica, for being with me and for all your help in launching this white paper. And I hope I will see you all today, all in the audience very soon. I'm always missing the part where we can all have a glass of wine together. I was quite happy to do this in London and Paris. And I will have to press the end button now, wishing you a very good evening or a very good day wherever you are in the world. Bye, everyone.